Thank you. Just let me talk a bit about Asia when it comes to how we approach the issue of aging. Asia, as you all know, it's diverse. We have the countries in West Asia, the Arab countries mostly, which have very strong values in terms of religion, and that shapes how they view things. We have the South Asian countries, and then you go further east to the part of the world where I'm from, where we have what here people call the more Eastern values that has been shaped by different things in our past. But I think what this has led to when it comes to aging is that it has this traditionalist sort of approach, which is in a sense welfare, in that once you get older, it is up to your children to take care of you. And if the state is going to provide, then the state would only provide the bare minimum in terms of a pension or some sort of social protection. But the result is that that is never enough, and you have to count on your children. And you know, of course, we all hope that our kids would be good children and take care of us when we grow older. But not everyone has kids, first of all, and for those that have kids, not all the kids are good. So you get into this situation where, unfortunately, compounded by a lack of government support, compounded by the changing values that happen over time, where this idea of filial piety is not as strong as perhaps it was 50 years ago, and added to the fact that you do have aging populations in Asia, that it becomes less and less of a safeguard for those who are aging. In terms of the Asian populations, of course, we all know Japan, the example, classic example, that is used in all sorts of literature and discussions on this issue. But then as you go look at the other countries, a lot of it tends to be related to the level of economic development, but it is not necessarily so. You have in countries such as the ROK in Singapore, high levels of aging, and this is a concern for them. But then you also go to other countries for the so-called middle income, such as my own Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, which have this problem. As you go further west, it changes a bit. There is a big youth population in countries such as India, Pakistan, and further west into the Arab countries in the Middle East, and in Iran to in Persia. So you have this diversity of the issue of aging when you talk about Asia as a whole. And I think to look at Asia, one has to look, one, at the individual countries, but also regionally, because that is where the differences lie. Now, another way that governments approach the issue in Asia, I would say in general, is that they only see aging as a problem or as a requirement only when it becomes a problem or a requirement. Japan takes the lead in this, in that they've had this problem for a while. But I would have to say, unfortunately, for many countries in Asia, this issue hasn't surfaced other than in the past maybe 20, 30 years or so. And for some other countries, not even in the past 10 years, simply because there was Madrid. Madrid forced them into a situation where they had to look at the policies that they had in place and whether that was sufficient. So in that sense, I think Asia is not as developed when it comes to this issue as a whole as compared to, say, Europe or Latin America, or even Africa. I think is a bit more advanced than Asia as a whole when it comes to approaching this issue. Now, I think there are too many current concerns that occupy governments now for them to see aging as something of a problem. But it is something that happens. It is something that will happen to all societies, regardless of how big a youth population you have. We all know that the sociological studies indicate that eventually any sort of population will reach a point where they will have more of an aging population than a youth population. That is a given. But how do we prepare for that? And we can't prepare for that when it becomes a problem. We have to do that now. In terms of coming up with a convention on this, I think that my perspective is that a convention is good. As Luz mentioned, it has to be consensus-driven. It has to be something that we can work together. Unfortunately, here in the UN, I would have to say that we've somewhat diverted our attention in terms of looking at the priorities and what we need to do to tackle this issue. What we have faced in the past few years is that when there has become talk of the issue of aging and whether or not we would have an instrument, and specifically a convention when we talk about an instrument, is that some countries have said, well, if you have a convention on the aging, convention on the rights of older persons, then therefore you are dividing the universality of human rights. It's a serious issue, but it's not the issue at hand, because no one here is talking about human rights not being universal. We all recognize that, and we all know that human rights is universal, is indivisible, and all the other big words that we tend to use here. But that is not the issue. Unfortunately, that becomes the issue, because that becomes the argument that people use. That they say that we have a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. If you have one with older persons, then next you would have one for migrants, for indigenous people, and so on, and go down the list. I am not that pessimistic. I don't think any sort of those fears will come about. But having faced those realities and knowing that that is sort of the situation we face in the UN, then a step-by-step approach then becomes the next best thing. Now, there are recommendations in the report by the Secretary this year to consider coming up with a working group of the Commission on Social Development. That is one step. It's a positive step. But there are also other sort of recommendations that have been raised in the past by Special Rapporteur and other sorts of instruments. I think these require serious consideration by governments here, by countries here. And I think the role of civil society in building up that mass effect at the grassroots level is very important. The fact that this event here today is organized by 9 different civil society organizations is wonderful, and I think this is something that is positive and it's something that should be emulated. And I would also challenge that this sort of event is something that should not only take place here at the UN or in Geneva or in, say, with all respect to Western countries where there's a bigger representation of NGOs, but it has to be taken also and done in the developing countries. I would say that in general, Asia, if there were to be some sort of discussion or work towards coming up with a convention on the rights of older persons, I think Asia as a whole would be very positive on that. Asia, we have in the past been maybe not the most vocal, but we have always given the support when it comes to these different conventions, and a lot of the governments in Asia try to do their best at least to sign and ratify these or to accede to them and to become full implementers of these conventions. So I think on that side I am quite optimistic that Asia will be very supportive if this would come about. But then what we need on the other hand is those countries that have, so to speak, the more stronger leadership position on this, those groups of countries that can have a larger voice, they are the ones who need to step up, and I think once they do that, then the rest will follow. Thank you.